There are many versions of the American dream. Sometimes we think it's about going from log cabin to White House or from rags to riches. But there was a different dream that Martin Luther King had. And I want, for my reading today, take some excerpts from this extraordinary dream, from this extraordinary prophet in Washington, D.C. in August of 1963. And I'm just going to take 3 excerpts from it. It is very difficult to do justice to the passion and the oratory of this extraordinary character. So I give it my best shot. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. Words inspired by God. It's time for us to have our own dream, not just the American dream of rags to riches or log cabin to White House, and even a dream that surpasses that of Martin Luther King. And that's what I want to devote my homily today. We'll start with a story. There was a competition held in ancient Greece 3,000 years ago, where they assembled all the great sages of Greece. And they wanted a competition to see who could come up with the pithiest aphorism, the one-liner that had most wisdom in it. And the one that won the competition was a simple phrase, "This too shall pass." One of the greatest aphorisms in history, I believe. And certainly it is very pertinent in the circumstances in which we find ourselves today as families, as nations, and as a world community. But if I were to try to pick out an aphorism for our times, which is even more pertinent perhaps, I would go back to an extraordinary teacher. He was a professor of philosophy in Harvard, a guy called George Santayana. He was Spanish, but he worked in the United States and then retired and died actually in Rome. And his quotation is frequently misquoted. What he actually said was, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that's what I want to do today, very, very briefly for us. I want to revisit our past in order that we may avoid the mistakes we've made and create the nation of our dreams into the future. And to do that, I'm going to make 5 main points briefly this morning. I'm going to do, firstly, a quick recap of a few points I made last Sunday, because last Sunday I told you it was the first of 3 homilies. The first one having to do with how the family can deal with this invitation of being quarantined. And I called it Cellmates or Soulmates. Today I want to deal with how we do this as a nation. And I know this morning we have people from Africa, from Kenya particularly, and in Germany who are participating in this Eucharist. So, think of your own country as I go through this exercise. And next week, God willing, I want to look at the invitation of this as a global community. So I go from family to nation to globe. But for today, I want to focus on the nation. And I would title the homily, Partisan Politics or Co-Creating the Country. That's the theme I have. So firstly, I want to do just a quick recap of what I said last Sunday. And then I want to look at American history, particularly in 50-year chunks. Thirdly, I want to look at my own analysis, the trajectory and the lessons we've learned from our 250 years. Fourthly, I want to talk about the notion of our national karma. And then fifthly, creating the future USA, our Kenya, or Germany, wherever you happen to be this morning. So let me do a quick recap of last Sunday's homily, because if there's anything I would like to contribute to the world situation at this stage, I would like to keep repeating this mantra that I gave last week and will give again next week and today. And it's this, that every single one of you, every single human being on planet Earth, all 7.6 billion of us, volunteered to be here now. We didn't just land here by mistake and find ourselves in this situation. We volunteered to be on planet Earth at this stage, knowing only three things. As we raised our hand and said to God, send me, I'll go. All we knew was the past histories of all of the other players who were going to be on stage with us. We knew how they performed in previous incarnations, including how we performed ourselves. We knew exactly the conditions into which we were parachuting, that we would meet a situation like this, and we knew what our mission was. Now, somebody might say, why in God's name would we volunteer for these kinds of circumstances? So I want to appeal to the mothers of you out there, you who have had 2 or more children. In the middle of your labor during your second birth or the third child, did you say to yourself at some stage, why in God's name did I sign up for this? And you signed up for it because you wanted to bring new life into the world. But for the moment, in the labor pains, it seems like a very foolish choice. And right now, there are people all over the world in labor, trying to birth a new world. And we're asking ourselves, how in God's name could I possibly have signed up or volunteered for this? But you did, and you were here. And the second thing I want to say is this, it is improv theater. There is no script. There's no plot that we're going to follow. We're going to make this up as we go along. And so there were 2 rules to improv theater when you're on stage with another actor. The first rule is you cannot reject a line that your partner offers to you. You have to work with what's been given to you. And the second rule is you have to feed your partner, and I mean all 7.6 partners you have on planet Earth right now. You have to feed them lines that make them look good. Feed them lines they can work with and they can grow from. And in the middle of last week's homily, I suggested an exercise to you in order for you yourself personally to understand the purpose of your trip on planet Earth. And I suggested that you break your life up into 7-year chunks from age 0 to 7, 7 to 14, 14 to 21, etc. And that you ask yourself 3 questions for each of those chunks. Number 1, who were the important players during that period of my life? Secondly, what were the important events that occurred during that period of my life? And thirdly, what were the important lessons that I learned from that period of my life? And I made the observation, having done that many, many years with clients of mine as a psychologist, I've seen that the players will be different from era to era. The events will be different from era to era, but the lessons are always the same. There are 2 or 3 basic lessons that will keep repeating in different circumstances with different players in different events throughout your lifetime. And that will show you what your purpose is, what you've come to learn and what you've come to contribute. So that's just a quick recap of what I said last week. Now I'd like to go a little bit further. I want today to try to look at American history, and with the caveat that I have never formally studied American history. But I've lived here for 33 years and I've picked up stuff en route. And so over the last week, I just sat down to think for myself, if I were to do a quick recap of American history, I'm going to divide it into 5 segments, just 50-year chunks. I'm going to start in the year 1770, from 1770 to 1820. Number 2, from 1820 to 1870. Number 3, from 1870 to 1920. Number 4, from 1920 to 1970, and number 5, from 1970 to the present moment, 2020. And it's going to be obviously very, very personal, because any one of you, as you conduct this exercise, whether you do it, as citizens of the United States or of Kenya or Germany, wherever you are, to do it in your own country, it'll be very personal, because the things I'll remember from what I picked up may be very different from the things that you'll remember, as you do this exercise. And particularly, if you have studied American history, you're going to have a much better handle on it than I will. But I just give you my own impressions of what I've picked up over 33 years of living in this country. I'm going to pick out what for me were the salient features of all of those chunks of time. And then I go on to draw the kind of the lessons we learned as a nation. So let me begin with 1770. In 1770, there were 13 colonies in North America from people who'd come from Europe, particularly from England. And they were still being ruled from England. And they were being taxed outrageously. There was a tax on stamps. There was a tax on paper. And then there was in 1973, the tax on tea leaves. And this was just too much for people. So in 1773, December 1773, is the famous Boston Tea Party, where with John Adams and John Hancock involved, they tipped 450 tons of tea into the Atlantic Ocean. And the British replied. And in 1776, they decided it was time for independence. So 1775 is the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And it lasts for about 6 years and is toing and froing during that period of time. It wasn't very obvious at various stages whether it would succeed or not. But in the middle of that, they gave us the Declaration of Independence in 1776, followed by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And in my opinion, it was a document that was worthy of being included in the scriptures, extraordinarily inspirational. But just like the scriptures, it was a document of its time, and it had shadow places, dark spots, just like the scriptures do. We think that the scriptures are the inspired word of God, and in some senses they are, but they're also the projection of the human shadow. So in the same scriptures that God saves his people, God mandates the genocide of the native peoples of the land of Canaan. Women are discriminated against in the scriptures, and slavery is allowed in the scriptures. And the same thing happened with our Declaration of Independence and our Bill of Rights. In that great document that says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, except if you happen to be a Native American Indian man, in which case there are going to be massacres, or unless you happen to be a man with black skin, in which case you're a slave, or if you happen to be a female, in which case you're not even allowed to vote or to own property. So this extraordinary document was an extraordinary movement forward in our times, but it had dark shadow material as well. So these are the events of 1770 to 1820. And then in 1803, there was the famous Louisiana Purchase, where for $15 million, they bought this Louisiana and became a state of the Union. And this was very important because the Mississippi was a major waterway. And in fact, with the purchase of Louisiana, which had changed hands many times between the Spaniards and the French previously, they bought it from Napoleon, who was trying to finance his own wars in Europe for $15 million. And with that one act, they almost doubled the size of the United States. So that would be my understanding of that particular chunk from 1770 to 1820. 1820 to 1870, in the middle of that period, California becomes the 31st state of the Union. And then in the year 1861, all hell breaks loose. Civil war that lasts for 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. A war in which at least 650,000 Americans killed each other. And the war ended on the 9th of April in 1865. And 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. At the end of that year, with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in December of 1865, was the abolition of slavery, and 4 million Americans were set free. And in 1870, at the end of that period, in the 15th Amendment, African Americans were given the vote. Women still didn't have it. They wouldn't have it for another 50 years. But African Americans were given the vote in 1870, even if they still didn't have civil rights for another 100 years. The third chunk of it for me would be 1870 to 1920. And we start off with, in 1898, the Spanish-American War, which may well have been actually a false flag operation. An explosion took place on the American ship, the USS Maine, and it may very well have been a false flag to get us into a war with Spain. In 1913 was the creation of what's sometimes called the creature of Jekyll Island, the Federal Reserve, which is not federal. It's a group of private people who created a banking system although the governors are appointed by the United States right now, they create the money, they loan it to the government at interest, and the interest, the government forces us to pay taxes so that these people can get fatter and fatter and fatter. It's over 100 years old at this stage, the Federal Reserve. Between 1914 and 1918, we had the what was called the Great War, allegedly the war to end all wars. And we as Americans got into it towards the end of that process. At the end of that period, just when we thought the war was over, we can go back home, was the Spanish flu that killed millions of people worldwide. Something a bit like what we're trying to deal with right now. And then at the end of that period, 1920, with the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, women get the right to vote. So that would be that third period. Which leads me into the 1920 to 1970 period. And this begins perhaps with the Great Depression, when America is literally on its knees, economically on its knees. It's followed shortly by World War II, and we get into World War II. And World War II will kill maybe 50 million human beings. Around this time, 1947, as soon as World War II ended, there's the creation of the CIA. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. An extraordinary, nefarious organization that has been responsible for murder and mayhem throughout the world since Whitley. We got into a whole other series of wars. The war to end all war allegedly ended in 1918. It's followed by the Second World War from 39 to 45. And now we're involved in Korea. The Korean War goes on from 1950 to 1953. In the middle of that period, some good news, Alaska becomes the 49th state of the Union. And then that very same year, Hawaii becomes the 50th state of the Union. But I want to give you some of the backstory to Hawaii. Because Hawaii had been an independent country and it had its own queen. And in 1893, this queen was forced to abdicate by a conglomerate consisting of Christian missionaries, merchants from the States, and the Marines, actually an invasion by Marines. She was dethroned, and in 1898, the United States annexed the province of Hawaii. And in 1959, it became the 50th state in the Union. And this protocol where you send in missionaries who are interested in exploiting the resources, you force the government out of power, and you create a situation where either through assassination or destabilization, you get the opportunity to ransack the resources of the place. We did that in spades during this period. Between 1955 and 1975, we're involved with 3 more wars. We're involved in the war in Vietnam, the war in Laos, and the war in Cambodia. And again, the Cambodian War was a false flag, the Gulf of Tonkin incident where, in order to get in an excuse for invading Cambodia, we created this. It was a time, 1964 begins, the war protests in our country. We had enough of all of these foreign wars, enough already. It was the era of the psychedelics and the summer of love in 1967. And in the middle of that period, you had the assassination of JFK in 1963. And you had the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy in 1968. And then to end off that period, in 1969, July 20th, you have the moon landing. So this extraordinary concatenation of different kinds of events. And then maybe the final period from the 1970s down to our own period in 2020. I'm just absolutely cherry picking from my own kind of experiences here. You have Silicon Valley coming into prominence, the extraordinary abilities and talents congregating in one little area around Palo Alto, Mountain View, that area. You had the invention of the internet from what was called the ARPANET in 1983 and the World Wide Web in 2013. And during that time, we became very concerned about issues like climate change, or endangered species, and GMOs and pesticides. We became aware of that and began to try and deal with it. During this entire period, particularly in Meso and South America, you had the CIA intentionally destabilizing, democratically elected people. It had begun actually in 1960. Eisenhower's last act as a president before he handed over to JFK was to organize, or at least give the thumbs up, for the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, who had been elected the first democratically elected president of the Congo, what had been the Belgian Congo before, and he's assassinated under orders from the United States of America because of resources that the Congo had to offer. We would continue to employ this strategy in South America and Mesoamerica, where you destabilize regimes in the Middle East or South America, assassinate leaders, or elect people of our choices. And this went on nonstop. Right in the middle of that, we had the 9/11 incident, where the war is brought to our own territory and we experience firsthand what it's like to be invaded and to be bombed. But rather than learn from this lesson and think about creating peace in our world and peace in our times, we invaded Iraq, we invaded Libya, and we invaded Afghanistan. There are 195 countries in the United Nations at the moment. There's an American military presence in 150 of them. So we've got troops in 75% of the nations of the world. And as a result of the 9/11 attack, we create legislation like the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, which were Trojan horses in order to introduce some kind of, martial law or to take away, our civil rights. We're now subject to all kinds of mass, surveillance. There's the censorship via algorithms of various kinds of people like Facebook and Google, so that they determine what we're allowed to say, what views we're allowed to have. And then finally, there's the whole development of artificial intelligence, which is going to have a huge effect. And I'll talk next Sunday about that, the global effects of transhumanism, where there's not just a bifurcation, but possibly 4 different routes in which the human species is going to continue to evolve. So that's the bad news. That's point number 2. So all of that is just pieces that I've picked up. You'll pick up very, very different pieces perhaps as you do this exercise for yourself. And now I want to what is my own kind of analysis of my understanding of our history? And it seems to me that this would be the trajectory, that as a colonized people way back in 1770, we won our freedom. But this was a freedom that conferred rights only on some people. You could only vote if you were white, a landowner, a male, and more than 21 at that stage. Slowly by slowly, we improved. The Native Americans didn't have the right to vote and were hounded and killed. 4 million African Americans were enslaved, and all of the women didn't have the right to vote. But over a 200-year period, there's been an incremental improvement and evolution in our country. All of these rights being recognized, including civil rights, rights to vote, all of these things. And I think that evolution, it was slow, but it was steady, but it crested somewhere in the 1960s, 1970s. And at that stage, some oligarchy in our country decided it was time for America to become an empire, to visit our will on the world. And there were 3 forms that this empirical agenda took, in my opinion. First is a kind of a cultural, a kind of imperialism through maybe TV or radio or Hollywood or whatever. We exported our culture and our language. The second one would be an economic colonialism, where we determine what we'll pay 3rd world countries for what they produce, and we'll determine what they have to pay for us for our technology. And there was a military aspect to this empire. So in my opinion, as I watched this entire trajectory, for 200 years, this extraordinary evolution, cresting somewhere in the 1960s and the 1970s, and been on a downward track since that period. That's my just personal analysis of the situation. You're going to come to your own conclusions if you choose to engage with this exercise for yourselves. Which brings me to my 4th point. I believe very strongly in the concept of karma, and I've done many homilies about karma. Karma for me is not a punitive mechanism whereby we're punished in subsequent periods of our lives or in subsequent incarnations for mistakes we made in previous ones. Karma is simply the law of cause and effect. You do A and B happens. If B is good, keep doing A. You do A and B happens. If B is not good, stop doing A. But we generate karma not just as individual people. Whenever you create a community, you generate community karma. COJ, or companions on the journey, or in this instance today, what I'm calling companions in diaspora, scattered throughout the world. As a community, we create karma. And karma can be good and bad. By our compassion and our love, we're creating good karma, which is affecting the outcome of our world. By being angry and judgmental and unforgiving, we're creating bad karma. So every group creates a group karma, whether that group is, COJ or the American nation or planet Earth. And I really believe that part of what I've called our preconception contract, the agreements we make as souls, long before we incarnate into different kind of roles on planet Earth, we make a preconception contract as an entire group of souls, all 7.6 billion of us, to try to create love and compassion in our world and in our times. But I've seen again and again that even organizations or groups that get together with a really positive, loving, compassionate agenda, if they're not really careful, it can deteriorate fairly quickly. And I've seen this particularly when I study the history of religions on our planet. They tend to go through the following stages. Firstly, you get a great charismatic prophet, like a Jesus figure or a Buddha figure. The second one is followers assemble around this charismatic individual. Thirdly, there's a community that formed. They recognize each other almost. Fourthly, there's an organization that erects on the basis of this community. And then almost inevitably, if we're not really careful, the bureaucracy takes over and there's some kind of a fundamentalist orthodoxy in the theology. And now that empowers us and allows us to make crusades against people who do not believe what we believe. So we go across the world in Europe in our crusades, beginning in 1099, killing Greek Orthodox and Jews and Muslims. And then when we finished killing the problem outside, we start killing the problem inside. We now start with inquisitions of various kinds. And we torture people and burn them at the stake. And then at some stage, the entire group implodes, or else a new prophet comes along and invites us into a renewal. And I see this very same thing happening, in our world, in our country right now. What are the crusades today? They're the American wars we've been involved in and continue to involve in. We've got soldiers in 150 different nations. And what are the inquisitions? It is the surveillance, the Patriot Act and the NDAA, this mass surveillance of American citizens to find out who's really in line with our belief and who is not. Now, if you ever study world history, and I'll be talking about that next Sunday with God's help, empires always end badly. And they end in one of two ways. Sometimes they're overthrown by the next superpower that succeeds it. But more often, they actually implode from the inside out. They implode because of corruption within the system. They implode because of the oppression of ordinary citizens. They implode because of overtaxation. They implode because there's a chronic hijacking of national resources in the pursuit of endless foreign wars. And at that stage, we need a new prophet. The good news is that in our times, prophets are not coming as single individuals. Prophets are coming as movements, entire movements. And that will be the salvation of our country and of our world, which is what I want to finish with my final point, my fifth point. We have to realize that a nation is actually an illusion. It is the result of an intersubjective reality. A group of people agree, under the leadership often of some charismatic leaders, to form some kind of community or some kind of freedom. So, for instance, in 1917, a group of people in Russia overthrew the Tsar and created the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They had a whole new vision. It didn't exist before that. It was an idea in somebody's head, and a lot of people agreed, this is a good idea, we'll get behind it. And this was an idea that lasted just 75 years. And with the stroke of three pens, on the 26th of December in the year 1991, three leaders sat down and they signed documents that dissolved the USSR. It is no more as of December 26, 1991. Because a nation is an illusion. It is an intersubjective reality created by the fiat of people who say, yes, I will agree to this particular venture. We did the same ourselves in 1776, when under the leadership of the Founding Fathers, we created the illusion of the United States of America, and it survived for 250 years. But it must continue to evolve and not on the downward spiral of becoming an empire that's invading other lands. We have to try to re-envision a whole new dream for our country and for whatever country you find yourself in. A country in which there is real freedom, where there's no interference in the political system of other peoples anywhere else. We need to rebuild a country which is not built from the politicians down, but from spiritually energized, creative citizens upwards. So as we engage in our question and answer period, I'm going to appeal this to you. In this analysis of our history, at this stage, I have zero interest in naming names right now or in name calling right now. And please do not mention any names, whatever side of the divide you're on. I don't want to hear about any present day politicians. What I want to hear about is your ideas and your dream for building a new nation under God. We don't have any party politics in this, please. Away at the beginning of this year, on January 5th, in the first homily of 2020, I talked about my own 2020 vision for our country. And I talked about setting up at some stage what I called a reconciliation Sunday, where we would devote one Sunday's liturgy completely to a multimedia presentation of how we can dream a new dream for our country. What would it look like? What I'm appealing to you right now, as you're confined to your own homes, not just that you look at your own trajectory and your own history in the 7-year chunks exercise, that's valuable, but for this week, I would really appeal to you. Look at the history of your own country in 50-year chunks and find out what has the trajectory of that been. And then dream a whole new dream for your country. We had the typical American dream of rags to riches. We had Martin Luther King's beautiful dream. But I want us to dream a dream which is even greater than Martin Luther King's dream. Martin Luther King had a dream of liberating an abused minority. My appeal to you today is to dream a dream that liberates the human soul itself. Namaste.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much. With what you said at the end, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's actually what I have been practicing these past few weeks. And I feel that in itself is putting out an energy that will help everyone. So thank you for that.
Brilliant. So let me make a comment on that, Susie, because I believe that time is a very malleable commodity. So the past, there are two versions of the past. There's the actual past, what actually happened, and then there's the fictitious past, what we were told about the past. And both of them have influenced where we are right now. There are two versions of the present. There's the actual present, and there's the fictitious present. There's the actual present of what's actually happening in our world, and then there's the fictitious present, present of fake news or whatever. But there are three kinds of future, and that's what I want to focus on. There's the possible future, there's the probable future, and then there's the future we will actually create. So it reminds me of quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, it is the observer that collapses the wave of all possibilities down to what actually happens. You take, wave which operates you take light which operates as a wave, and through observation, you can reduce it down to its particle format. The same thing is true of the future. I do not believe in a predetermined, inevitable future. It does not exist. There are possible futures. There are probable futures which will happen if we don't change what we're doing. And then there's the future we'll actually create by our intentionality. And that's exactly what you're saying. So I believe in the notion of parallel universes, again from physics, that there are literally infinite numbers of ways in which things can combine to create possible outcomes. Our job is not so much to create the future, rather it is to select out the future of our choice by where our attention and our intentions go. And this is where prayer and meditation come in. If I'm focused, and driven by my anxiety and my fear and my hatred of particular individuals right now, I'm creating an ethos in which the likely outcome, I'm selecting from all the possible futures, a future which is built on hatred and anger and unforgiveness. If I have it in my heart to be compassionate and loving and realizing everybody is trying their best to do what they're doing right now, I'll create a future in which I'll select out a future which is built on love and compassion for all. Great question, Susie.
I wanted to ask Sean exactly what you were just saying, to say a little bit more about the practices that we can do every day. And I think you answered some of my question about how to hold the current situation so that we are creating a different future in our own inner life right now, in our outer life.
Right. Christine, a great question. So again, I want to repeat that you can't change the world unless you change the nations first, individual nations. And you can't change a nation unless you change yourself. And so I go back to what I said last Sunday. It all begins with the individual person. It all begins with self-transformation. And that has to do with, learning to kind of make sure I'm not operating out of anxiety or anger or fear. And so I give some exercises the last day, like making sure you're keeping to a regular schedule. Get up at the same time every day, whether or not you're going to work now. Go to sleep at the same time. Get out of doors. Have the sunlight on your face, fresh air in your lungs, exercise, go barefoot and touch Pachamama, touch the earth itself. Look at a sunrise, write your own autobiography, make sense of your own life trajectory. Try to visit in meditation be in dialogue with your own soul. What have I personally come to do? What is my contribution to this? And how best can I protect myself, make sure I'm healthy, physically, sociologically, psychologically, and spiritually. So by transforming myself, I'm transforming my family and my nation and ultimately my country. It all begins with how you're dealing with your own issues.
I just have one more request actually for prayers, because the state parks are being closed. I'm sure many of you have seen it. The one thing that I so look forward to is what you're saying, is to go walking every day to survive through this, and also have a whole different feeling of dealing with our bodies. And right now they've closed 23 parks in San Mateo completely, and they've closed most of the other parks. So I just want to ask the whole community to pray and visualize that those parks will be open, because that was very, very disturbing to me, that the one thing that is so nourishing to us, is shut down. So I don't know if you have any comment, but to just see it as being open again.
Yeah, that's a great thing to pray for. I totally agree with you. And in the interim, I'm sorry to hear that news that parks will close down. Bring the park inside. If you have a potted plant, or if you have a little tiny piece of lawn, take some lawn or a plant into your home, nurture it, listen to it, talk to it, and have it talk to you.
Kate.
What I was reminded of in the latter part of what you were sharing is what Thich Nhat Hanh has said, that the guru is the sangha.
Brilliant.
The teacher is the community.
Brilliant.
And we're hearing people say things like, we are the people we've been waiting for. There's this awareness, but what I'm seeing is that this is very challenging for humans to come together in such a way that we are able to move forward into a new vision. Requires a shift in our consciousness. We're no longer followers of an external guide, but we need to shift to paying attention to our inner guide. But what I'm seeing is a lot of difficulty with this, that communities, and I know you have a beautiful community that this is my first time witnessing really in this way, but will you help us as community builders, wherever we are, deal with the different challenges that we have? If this is a true shift in the way, if the guru is the sangha, help us be the type of sangha that God's wisdom can come through.
That's a brilliant observation, Kate. And for those of you who don't know, Kate is the person who's editing my new book. I'm deeply grateful for the leadership she's offered to me. She's also done postgraduate work in history. So if anybody has qualified Kate to do the 50-year chunks exercise, it's you. And I totally agree with your observation that the guru is the sangha. Absolutely beautifully put. And for those, yesterday actually, Kate and I had a meeting with 2 members of the Hildegard von Bingen community, a community of women who's doing the same thing that COJ is doing. creating online communities right now. So these are beginning to pop up. And Kate, she and Roach, is at the core of many of these outfits. She was involved with Contemplative Life for a long time. Herself and a man called Jeff Gunung have formed some extraordinary online communities. So Kate, I need to learn from you rather than you learn from me in this format. So, you know, if there's anything that, of all the groups that you're involved in, if you can pass wisdom on to us, we'll be deeply grateful for you, for learning from you as well. But definitely, it is the sanghas that will change. It's not individual or charismatic, you know, gurus.
Well, that's very humbling, Sean. Thank you for saying that. The work I'm doing right now is exactly that, and I need the wisdom and the example of communities that are doing this well. I'm working with an evolutionary biologist named David Sloan Wilson, who is developing something called pro-social, which is just sort of how the biological systems work to the benefit of all. And we're creating something called pro-social spirituality. But I feel so inadequate to be doing this that it's laughable. So I will keep watching what COJ is doing and other groups that I've been watching for years. I will ask for your guidance and ask for your prayers as I attempt to write this curriculum that will help groups function for the good of the all.
Thank you so much for what you do in the world, Kate.
I'm unmuting you, Trish.
It's interesting that you would discuss what you were discussing today, and I think that ontologically it could be a time of healing for not only emotional but physical needs. And I was reading something this week that I wanted to get your thoughts on. The author was opining that if you can really practice being in the present, you know, whether it's by breathing or focusing on various aspects of your body for 10 seconds at a time, but not being dictated by past or future, but really being in the moment, that this can, number one, it makes our molecular structure a lot less dense. Number two, it allows our cell capacity for renewal to be greatly enhanced, and also strengthens our immune system. So as we look at this as a time of healing, I want your thoughts on that, because I think you're right. You know, change can't happen until we change ourselves. So.
Right. Great, Trish. So yeah, we are right on again. So there is only the present moment, actually, because the past, in some sense, you have never done anything in the past. You have done something in a present moment that is now part of your history, and you will never do anything in the future. You will do something in a present moment which is yet to come. But literally, we live in a concatenation of present moments. And there are uses and abuses of the present moment. A great use of the present moment is to trawl the past for lessons learned, you know, and to kind of prepare for a future by envisaging the one we want to select out. But the worst use of the present moment is to be angry about the past, or guilty about the past, or to be fearful or anxious about the future. That's a wasted present moment. But ultimately, once you've trawled the past and learned from it, and once you've created the future of your choice by selecting out what you want to happen, now you've got to live that on a daily basis, literally with every single breath you breathe. And it's interesting that this virus is actually attacking the breath, because in many, many, many languages, the word for breath and life and spirit is the same word. In Hebrew, the word is ruach. It's breath and life and spirit. In Greek, it's pneuma. In Swahili, we use the word pepo. And pepo can be breath, you know, it can be spirit, can be life in a sense, the life force. In English, it even sneaks in English. We call it about inspiration and expiration. To inspire means to take spirit in. It means to breathe in, or it means to be creative or alive. And to expire is to let go of spirit, or to breathe out, or to die. So literally, with every breath you take, you are literally creating your own physical body. Every time you breathe in and out, you're sharing literally, and biologically speaking, millions of molecules of matter with your environment. The home you live in, 50% of the dust in your home is dead skin cells. So we're constantly shedding the spacesuit. And the breath becomes the interface between spirit and matter. And so if you can tie your breathing to the healing of your body, to the healing of your emotions, to the healing of your intellect, to the healing of your family and your community and your nation and your world, then as you go about your day on a regular basis, you can give yourself a kind of a post-hypnotic suggestion where you say, every time I breathe in new life and energy into every part of my being. And every time I breathe out, I let go of the toxicity of my biochemistry or my neurology or my psychology. So with every single breath. And then as you mindfully engage with the tasks of the day, whether you're working in the garden or making a cup of coffee for yourself, as you're breathing in and out, you're unconsciously, you're enacting that agenda, of self-recreation.
Ria has a question.
It's a question, or more a comment, that you asked how can we what are we personally doing, and living in Silicon Valley, life can be very frantic, and there are many people who are very privileged in Silicon Valley that earn very high salaries, and a lot of people have an option of working from home.
Right.
And during this time, we've got essential workers, we've got the healthcare workers,
Yes,
but there are other
yes.
essential workers as
Yes.
well. There are the ones that are in the supermarkets that are earning so much per hour. There's the gig economy delivery drivers who are delivering goods like in Instacart without, they've got no hand sanitizer, they've got no masks, they're just, they're going to go on strike on Monday because they earn $7 an hour,
Right.
plus their tips. So it's for me, it's becoming more aware, and it's also, many of us in Silicon Valley have got people that do things. We have cleaners coming in, we've got gardeners, we've got pool people, and, we're paying them while they're not coming, but we are extremely privileged to be in this situation. And for me, it's now having a much greater awareness. I did think I had an awareness of what people did, but, in the last 2 weeks, I realized I don't,
Okay.
So I think that's how, my mindset's trying to change a bit.
That's great, Ria. So I totally agree with you. And so a few Sundays ago, I don't remember when it was, in the homily I did on the temptation to power, I talked about different, economic models that have been tried throughout world history and different governmental systems, all the way from dictatorships to theocracies, to communist regimes, to capitalist regimes, and opined that in the times in which we live at this stage, we have to create brand new economic models, totally different economic models and totally different governmental systems. Economic models that, honor the contributions that everybody makes, whether it's the guy who's picking up the garbage or the CEO of Google, that the disparity between what they're earning is absolutely criminal. And that we must envisage during this time of seclusion, as we're envisaging a new nation for ourselves, it must involve trying to create, firstly, as a mental construct, and then as a sociological phenomenon, the kinds of economic models that honor all workers right across the spectrum, do not distinguish between them to the extent that we are with these vast discrepancies in daily wages or hourly wages. We have to start dreaming that great dream at this stage. Start dreaming great, methods of self-government as nation groups that don't involve, excessive military domination or surveillance states. But we're going to have to dream that before it becomes a reality. At some stage, I think, it may have been the Christmas homily, I talked about the notion of a tulpa. And a tulpa is a Hindu and a Buddhist notion that thoughts become life forms. If a thought is given enough attention and enough intentionality, it actually eventually translates into an energy form that can interact, as a separate being with the person who originally had the thought. And if enough persons succumb to this idea, like the kind of intersubjective reality, we literally create a thought form force which fashions the future. And so during this time of retreat, we have to start creating those tulpas. Tulpas based on compassion and forgiveness. Tulpas based on precisely what you said. A system, an economic system, which honors the sweat of everybody under the sun and does not discriminate among them. So now is the time to begin, maybe speaking to each other like, what about if we did X? What about if we did Y? I wonder would this work? That's what's going to happen. We're going to create a national tulpa, and next week I'm going to talk about creating a global tulpa, which will be the angel of God beckoning us into a future of love and compassion and equality.
I'd like to ask Joanna to ask a question.
this time is sort of like I can't think of the word anymore. It's like more than a retreat. It's like we're all going on these inner journeys.
Okay.
And what is happening is if you live alone or you're with somebody else, we're turning to each other.
Yes.
All of these things have been eliminated. We can't go shopping. We can't watch sports. We can't go to plays. We can't go to movies. Although TV is there 24 hours a day. But we probably are discovering we don't need as much. We don't have to eat as much. And I think that we're going to wake up to a really different world when we come outside. Mm-hmm. I don't even want to talk about the changes that are going to come, the businesses that are going to be shut and all of these things, because I don't want to dwell on fear. But this is a time of rest before this other really big comes. And I think that we really are going to have to come out even more really taking care of each other and turning to love. And I am experiencing every day more and more gratitude that I am not living in a studio somewhere with 2 kids and have lost my job. Right. And that the kids are home alone. There's more occurrences of child abuse and all kinds of things that are going right now, so that we because people are compressed. I have a view I can look out on. I am so grateful every day, more and more, about what I do have. I have enough of food for a couple of weeks. And I have this community, you know, and I have friends I can talk to on the phone. So I think as I build that inside of myself, that to be able also, I'm trying to figure out ways to feed my community and locally people who don't have food. Right. And for those of us who have time to do that, because some people are still working, you know, like I'm so grateful for Susan and everyone in the healthcare industry. But this is a real time of we you know, it sounds horrible, but we need to be grateful for this time in some ways. Right. And come out trying to be able to act on our love when we are able to walk back out these doors.
Beautiful words, Jan. Absolutely. That is the invitation of our times. So it's interesting that in the Jewish system, 1 day a week was set aside as the Sabbath, you know, and no work was done, you know, and of course that was eaten into, you know, early Christianity, and even, you know, some branches of kind of evangelistic Christianity still kept it. You couldn't do anything on a Sunday. There's some beauty to that, but we ate into that like there was no time for inner reflection. In the Jewish system as well, every 50 years there was what's called the Jubilee year. So after 7 periods of 7 years, the 49 years, the 50th year was, the land was given back to the people who originally owned it. So if I, you know, owned a piece of property, you know, and I sold half of it to my neighbor, you know, 30 years into this period, you know, at the end of 50, it had to come back to me. I had to kind of compensate him for it, but I got back, you know, what I started. So it's like they leveled the playing field every 50 years in some ways. And it feels to me like this is both a kind of a Sabbath and a Jubilee year for planet Earth. When a time when we begin to think, you know, how do we really redistribute the world's resources? How do we kind of show up so that we have equal rights and equal responsibilities? It's not just about equal rights, and it's not just about equal responsibilities, it's both. So how do we, when we look at the resources of our nation, whatever they're, intellectual resources, you know, physical resources, food resources, economic resources, whatever they are, how do we in some way equalize that without making the mistake, you know, that, you know, socialist communism did, where it just flattened the playing field forever and took food from everybody and brought it to the cities, and millions of people starved in the hinterland. 6 million Cambodians, you know, died from being forced out of cities to grow their own food in the countryside in a forced ruralization. And we suffer from a forced urbanization. So how can we rethink that and really look at the resources and the needs and begin some kind of a distribution, a redistribution of these, you know, which is not about just cutting off the heads of, you know, entrepreneurs who are creating opportunities. They're important as well. They create opportunities for the rest of us. So honoring the creative spirit and at the same time redistributing the resources without this huge discrepancy in the valuation of the individual.
Go ahead, Karen.
So Sean, I just had a comment about the bigger dream. And it seems to me that humans have a way of limiting their dreams. I'm looking for what is going to shift that, because everything that I believe is possible is the product of what we have already experienced. And so how do we, I can imagine, I mean, for myself, I think how wonderful it would be if everyone could have shelter, have food, have health, have education for their children. But in the back of my mind is the but that will never happen. But, you know, and so it's we're such creatures of our past that I'm wondering how we can shed that in order to dream the dream that's bigger. I think we know what the dream is. We kind of know it, but it's, I'm thinking that there's something in the manifesting that still feels like it's maybe missing.
Okay, great question. So I agree with you that the how is not important initially. What's important initially is the what. What is the dream we want? And then as we begin to brainstorm and be creative, the hows will reveal themselves. You know, so it's very important first that we have the idea and the dream itself. But I'm going to go into physics for a few minutes. You've got a son who's a physicist. There's a law in physics, the law of force. F represents force. And the force of attraction, the gravitational force, if you've got two heavenly bodies, I'm going to call them M1 and M2, M representing the mass of each object. The force that exists between two heavenly bodies is M1 multiplied by M2 divided by R squared. R is the distance between the two objects. And so if you want to increase that force, there are two ways of doing it. You can either increase the mass of one or both of the objects, and they'll exercise a greater attraction, or you can reduce the distance between the R. If the distance is less, then the force becomes greater. And so if the force of attraction is the mass of one multiplied by the mass of the other, divided by the square of the distance between them, then what you need to do is this. You need to dream a dream from a much bigger mass. Instead of dreaming a dream from your ego, which is a tiny little planet, you have to dream a dream from your soul, which is a massive planet. And instead of having a huge distance between them, predicated on your lack of belief that you could actually manifest it, you need to have trust and faith so that you can foreshorten the distance. So now you got two things. You got what you're trying to attract, the dream, and the attractor. And the attractor is huge because it's coming from the soul rather than the ego. And the distance is negligible because you're operating out of faith and out of trust. So how do you manifest the greater dream? You manifest the greater dream by making sure that you're dreaming from your soul and that you're doing it with trust and faith. And this is why you keep going back again and again and again and again. This problem will not be solved by just practical resolutions. They'll be the end result. They'll be the how-to eventually. But the shift is only going to come when we're operating at the soul level, at the belief system that we're eternal beings who volunteered for incarnation, that we're part of a preconception contract, that we came down here, we volunteered for a mission. When we operate from that reality, and we know that the mission is the creating of Christ consciousness in our world and in our time, that is a dream that cannot be stopped if it's accompanied by total trust and total faith.
Okay. I feel like for decades we've been learning practices, and so we've been training for this right now, and it's been seriously going on for 50 or 60 years, and so we need to kind of come out of our sort of our personal evolution into something, and it kind of goes to what Kate was talking about in terms of community, realizing that that there's more power in the group, and that we can it's making things, it's taking those first actions based on what we've learned.
Yeah, brilliant.
It starts to bring people together.
I make one final reflection on that. You know, it never made sense to me, and I've spoken about this many times, that biologists claim that 95% of our DNA is junk DNA. That has never made sense to me, ever. What I know is that, you know, creation has evolved a brain which is dedicated to the future, not just to the present. And that the brain space that we're not using right now, the neuronal connections that we haven't been making in the past, are now, we're ready to start making those kinds of connections now. And they're connections to our inner spirit. So we're going to begin activating that junk DNA in order to come up with solutions to our problems now, but they're driven by spirit, not just driven by, crisis or circumstance.
Thank you.
I'd like to call on Annika next.
Hi, Annika.
Good morning. Peace and blessings, dear brothers and sisters. Thank you, Father Sean, for the inspiring homily. The dream that I have for our world is that we affirm that we are one global family of love and compassion. I speak from this place of being a dreamer since I was a little girl, and life has led me to follow my heart, and life has led me to companions on the journey. And I have never before, a year and a half ago, experienced a community like Companions on the Journey. I believe that COJ, everyone here listening right now, has the potential and possibility of creating the biggest impact on our world during these times. And how we can do so, I believe, is to go within during this time, to truly practice self-responsibility, being compassionate with ourselves, to be interior life designers. This is a new term I just came up with earlier today, with a background in interior design and now doing natural integrative healing work. We are all designers of our lives. And I'd love to ask you, Father Sean, what does that mean to you, to be a designer, to be a creator during this time?
For me, what it means is that, as I say, I totally believe that we're all here by fiat. Every one of us, we just celebrated the Feast of the Annunciation on March 25th, where the angel Gabriel comes to Mary to ask her if she will be the mother of God. And 1400 years later, the famous Meister Eckhart said, "Of what benefit to me is it that my Savior was born of a virgin 1400 years ago? If he's not born again in my time and in my heart, every single one of us is meant to be the mother of God." And I believe that always. Every single one of us is meant to conceive the word of God, to carry it and to birth it into the world. And so my dream, particularly in the 33 years that I've been in Palo Alto, was to be part of a little community, which would be, a neuron on the cosmic, Christ consciousness brain, interacting with others to try to share, our abilities and our gifts. So for me, being a designer means that I have a particular place in the team. You have a particular place in the team. Karen has a particular place in the team. Mary Kate has a particular place in the team. Every one of us has a place in the team. Can I figure out what it is, and just do my part? And together we create the Christ conscious global brain, activating all of our potential. So I'm playing whatever little part I can play in that. Yeah.
Amen. Thank you so much.
I'd like to call on Wabin.
Hey, Father Sean.
Hi, Wabin.
Hey, I just wanted to share one little silly, goofy thing that, I try to do. I think I came here to share chocolate this lifetime. Okay. So,
okay, do you know my address?
I don't, but if you send it, you'll get something, trust me. But in Pacifica, we have 3 bins we put out every week, for garbage recycling and stuff like that. And for months now, even before all this started happening, I thought about those guys who get up every morning, mostly guys, to do the pickup, right? So I started putting a little candy with a note, a thank you note for each of them that pick those up, right? Just because saying a little thank you to those people, and I think someone else commented on that, those unknown people who do these things in our life, and just a little something like that, I think goes a long way. It doesn't have to be a big action. That's what I can do in my way, right? Because that's authentic to me. I like to give chocolate. So just, all of us have a little thing that we like, or it's our way, and put a personal spin on it,
That is beautiful, Wabin. That's really beautiful.
I just want to share that.
That's beautiful, buddy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, Father Sean. This is Etienne. My concern is that The idea of one compassionate, loving race is something that I embrace as human beings. That is at the core of who we are. But being the fact that in America specifically, for generations, we have been socialized to fear one another's differences.
Yes.
And particularly around racial differences, this whole construct and illusion of race.
Right.
And those of us who have the ability to identify as being white have benefited from this in ways that those of us who don't have that opportunity have never been able to enjoy. Now, being that we're here at this place of forced segregation, when up until this point it seems like it has been intentional just through cultural and societal norms to segregate ourselves into different neighborhoods and communities. My concern is that those of us who have the space to practice and to actually pray without disturbance, right? Because space is a great luxury and privilege that only those of us who are wealthy enough or have been privileged enough to enjoy. Would you agree? I mean, it's like when I work with communities who are impoverished, and I think of my own background, space was not available to us.
Right.
In poverty, you're just stacked on top of one another.
Right.
Creates a high level of frustration, irritation, and all kinds of emotional difficulties and challenges, which doesn't lend to the ability to sit and pray in a way that those of us who don't have those issues, we have that. It's very safe, it's very comfortable. We have our big homes and our rooms, and we could do that for ourselves. And in those spaces, we have this opportunity to cultivate the love and the compassion and project it out into the world. But I feel like it doesn't really address the underlying disparity, right? We're still segregated. We still are very ignorant as to what are the needs of those outside of our familiar communities and neighborhoods, and therefore at a loss of how to actually cause or promote the change that's necessary, right? Because if we're only as healthy as the poorest of us, the further we segregate, the further disparities are produced, and the more out of touch we become with each other, and the deeper we look within, is it possible that we're blinding ourselves to what's actually happening outside of ourselves? Does that make sense? Like, it's very safe and comfortable to look within, but it's very uncomfortable to go into areas and to have conversations with individuals who we've been socialized to fear because of their poverty or because of the color of their skin or because of their inability to have degrees or be educated or what have you, all the reasons that we separate ourselves and fear each other. So my concern is that how is it that we can face those parts of ourselves that are feeding the segregation? Because I really don't see America changing until we're able to feel that discomfort of having conversations with those folks who have been historically marginalized and suffer to provide the wealth and opportunity and privilege that the rest of the community or the rest of the country has had. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect sense at the end. Thanks a million. I totally agree with you. But before there can be sociological changes, there have to be internal, spiritual changes happening. And so obviously trying to create a social system, economic models and governmental systems that, break apart completely all kinds of barriers, socioeconomic barriers, color barriers, ethnic barriers, religious affiliation barriers. Before all of those can be sociologically kind of disassembled, there has to be the interiority. And so part of what I feel at this stage is, no matter how confined we are, firstly, we have to create sacred space in our own being. And then in our own little immediate environment, even if we're stuck in a house for the duration, we have to make a sacred space of that. But much more importantly, there are never going to be sociological changes. You can't enact legislation that forces people to be prejudice-free. You can make the kinds of changes, that make it a crime to break a particular law, but you're not going to legislate people into moral behavior, and you're not going to legislate people into spiritual behavior. That's only going to come from the interior journey. And so that has to happen in the heart of every single person. And from that will grow the ways in which we relate. From that will grow the realization that we're not looking at a person's skin color or listening to their accent. We're having a soul-to-soul connection, what Hindus will call the namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And that's why I keep insisting again and again and again and again, repeating as a mantra. There won't be any lasting changes, which are just sociological or legislative enactments of laws, which are not, coming from a cleansed, enlightened human heart. And when I get to the core of who I am, I don't have gender, I don't have ethnicity, I don't have an Irish accent. I'm an eternal being who volunteered for incarnation. And the more of us who come to that realization and begin relating from that place, the more likely it is that the sociological situation will begin to become obvious. It won't be just merely enacted legislation that will create the differences. It's the changed hearts and the changed self-understandings of the participants who select from the possible futures that which beckons us.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I guess my concern is that without engaging with those who are different than us, then it's still really be difficult to build healthy relationships with.
I get that at the end, but you can only relate differently to people whom you're biased against if you've shifted inside. If it's your soul that's reaching out to their soul. If we're still identified as belong to a particular color or class and trying to relate across that difference, that's going to dictate the terms of the relationship. So there has to be total interior alignment with who we really are as individuals, and the external barriers will just naturally dissolve as we relate.